Good morning, I'm Jukka Mähönen from the University of Turku, Finland, and I'll chair the second session. So we have 7 presentations in this session, and we have a coffee break in between, and so tight timetable. So I asked the presenters to the panel. We will have a panel, before lunch we will have a panel discussion with the participants, so please take your seats. And firstly, so in this session, we start looking for the reform proposals. And firstly, from the very, very basic and fundamental point of views, so corporate purpose and duties of the board. And firstly, we have the results of the Sustainable Companies cross-jurisdictional analysis of company law is presented. So shareholder primacy, the main company law barrier to sustainability. And Andrew Johnston will present now the results. So Andrew, please, either there, you are not you don't have PowerPoint, so I think if we start now immediately.
Okay, thank you, Jukka. Thank you, Beata, for inviting me. And I'm very proud to present our cross-jurisdictional research on core company law, which is a joint endeavor between Beata, Lynn Anker Sørensen, David Millen, and myself. As Beata said in her introduction, one of the first stages of the Sustainable Companies project was a mapping paper exercise, and we drew on a large number of mapping papers of jurisdictions around the world, common law, civil law, and hybrids. And we also drew on papers produced by Klaus Haupt for another collection of corporate governance. So what we were doing was exploring the barriers and possibilities in core company law. And by core company law, we're excluding the law of groups and we're excluding the law of accounting, both of which were sent off to other subgroups of this project and about which we'll hear later. What we concluded from this cross-jurisdictional analysis is that company law across jurisdictions is not unduly prescriptive. Now, because of common law influence, shareholders are often central to legal systems, but there is no requirement of absolute prioritization of the shareholder interest in any legal system that we surveyed, and I think our survey was comprehensive. Even Milton Friedman said that companies should maximize profits within the law and ethical custom. So even the strongest advocate of shareholder value didn't say, or shareholder primacy did not say, that shareholder interest should prevail at all costs. They should be bounded by law and ethical custom. Now, of course, on this project, we would probably go considerably further than that, but it's interesting to note this is what Friedman said. Shareholder primacy is the main barrier to sustainable companies. It's not core company law. Shareholder primacy, as we call it in the paper, a quasi-legal social norm, has emerged in the gaps that company law allows to directors. It's very powerful. Executive pay, takeovers, pressure from markets, pressure from investors, pressure from hedge funds, pressure from alternative financial vehicles, psychological constructions, sociological pressure, sociological constructions, advertising, business books, business gurus. I could go on. All of these things create a powerful force in our minds and in our societies that somehow shareholders come first. But this is not in company law. This exists in the gaps, in the interstices, in the space that company law leaves available to managers. Company law leaves space available to managers because company law deals with firms, and firms allocate resources within the economy in order to produce value, to produce wealth. Company law leaves unstated the different balance between the different groups, and its shareholder primacy moves into that gap. It colonizes that gap for its own purposes. Milton Friedman's ethical custom it looks very weak in the face of enormous flows of money and other kinds of incentives. We can't just rely on ethical custom. So what did we identify? Well, we identified, first of all, that a lack of explicit statement of what companies are for. Why does society allow companies to operate? Well, we constructed between ourselves, based on our readings, based on reading in the gaps in the law, what the purpose of companies is, but it's not explicitly stated in the legislation. Okay? Is society's purpose with companies simply to produce maximum returns for shareholders? Is it to produce what society needs to survive? Is it to meet social needs? Is it some balance of these things? This is left unstated, and one of our recommendations is that the law should be more clear about why we tolerate companies. Why do we recognize separate legal entities when they are not a natural thing? They are a social construct. Society constructs them. Why does society construct them? Why does it recognize them? So we want the law to be clearer about that. We want policymakers to be more explicit about the reason for which we all recognize companies. Then we moved on to look at the interests of the company. And in all jurisdictions, from the most shareholder value oriented, which is probably UK company law, which I'm going to speak about later in this panel, to the most pluralist, which is probably Germany or Norway. In between those two apparently very different extremes, we find, in reality, not a great deal of difference. The interest of the company is a loose constraint on company directors. But whether you are enlightened shareholder value or whether you are pluralist, the effect of both is to give managers considerable discretion. Now, actually, one of the things we found in the mapping paper was it was really quite difficult to pin down in relation to a surprising number of legal systems what the interests of the company actually is. A country like Germany, we would all say, yes, it's pluralist. When we start digging down into the legal foundations of German company law, it's actually not stated in the law either. So just as the purposes of the company is left unstated, in a number of important legal systems, the interests of the company is also left unstated. The interest of the company is then broadened, we found, by a business judgment rule, which in almost every jurisdiction that we surveyed is available. Sometimes it's wider, sometimes it's narrower. But the effect of the business judgment rule is really to gloss over, to smooth over the difference between pluralist and shareholder value jurisdictions. So in both cases, managerial discretion becomes wider. And as I said before, the wider managerial discretion becomes, the more scope there is for shareholder primacy to do its thing, for shareholder primacy to work its way into our brains, into our speech, into our public discourse. So the effect of shareholder primacy is that this broad discretion is not used, and we say the limits of this broad discretion are not even explored. Corporate directors, corporate executives are given incentives, constraints are imposed on them in the name of shareholder primacy. And shareholder wealth maximization prevails even though it's not mandated by law. In the fourth section of the paper, we then consider whether shareholders could do something. And we heard from Kate about, we could see in the picture that shareholders have the potential to drive forward sustainable corporate governance, but they don't. Now, a number of us have done research on this. There are market pressures, there are institutional shareholders, they have to meet returns expected by their beneficiaries, they have to meet their outgoings, and this is driving pressure for short-term shareholder returns. In our paper, and also by a paper by Benjamin Richardson, and in separate work by David Millen, we recognize the limits to what institutional shareholders can do. So while they have potential, we're not seeing a great deal from them as things stand. So having concluded that shareholder primacy is the problem and that corporate law actually offers possibilities for change, we then, in the final section, sketch out a few suggestions for how things might be reformed. Now, these are tentative. They're a first stab at making recommendations, and over the course of the next 2 days, we're going to hear a lot more recommendations for change, suggestions for change. So hopefully we can discuss among ourselves, like whether the things we say are realistic, whether the things that you say are realistic, and I'm really looking forward to it. We start off with an inclusive statement of the purposes of the company and the interests of the company, and we want it to be inclusive. So we want sustainability to be in there. Beata, in her own work, has said that sustainability needs to be raised to the level of a corporate goal. So we want this kind of inclusive statement, but we also want subsidiary changes. We want changes to the incentives and disincentives which are given to corporate managers. I'll talk about that in my presentation later. We want changes to directors' duties to require consideration of a broader range of interests. Those things, we also want directors to be under a duty to carry out due diligence as to the company's impacts on the environment. We want them to identify and to internalize those impacts. And we want enforcement. And enforcement is perhaps the point where I was thinking about this over the last week. How can we drive enforcement? Do we want private sector enforcement? Do we want collective action by stakeholders? Or do we want a regulator charged with holding directors to these due diligence duties? That's where we've arrived at. The problem is shareholder primacy. If we remove shareholder primacy, the potential of company law can be explored. Thank you.